Somebody asked, and I think this is a great question because there's so many good ones. What is your favorite photo of Trump?
Oh, well, of course you love the Kubrickian symmetry of standing behind the burgers. That's, of course, an iconic photograph. We love the burgers, don't we, folks? Look at the burgers. They're delicious. And I would say the opposite of that photo in terms of strikingness, but from like the other side, from like the underbelly of the court of the king's, the nude emperor. It's that stark shot of him coming back from Tulsa, the rally that ended up killing Herman Cain, where he is looking downcast and rumpled and has a big orange line on the inside of his shirt collar. Very, very, very good.
My personal is him yelling at the little boy mowing the lawn.
I love that. You know, that's one of my favorites, and I did a great tweet about this. When that picture came out, I said that's an awesome picture because it is the platonic ideal of a 1980s punk rock album cover. Like that guy just standing screaming on the lawn, and then with like a cutout name of a band. And I tweeted that, and then a bunch of people put mock-ups in my Menchies.
This is really good.
That one's very good. Yeah, they're all great. Aren't those? Isn't that good?
Yes.
Oh, the orb photo, also great.
Oh,
love the orb photo.
Yeah, that was absolutely like through the looking glass stuff.
You know what? Somebody asked a very weird question. The kind of question I usually ignore in these chats, like kind of the left field ones. But I thought it was really interesting because I had an immediate thought when I read it, which was, it said, "What is the most cursed picture of a politician?" And there's obviously a ton of contenders, but the one that immediately came to my mind without me even thinking about it, my first thought actually was, "Oh, how am I going to pick?" And then I just saw it. You guys won't remember this, and I'm wondering if I should, if I can show you on the screen here, because you're not going to have seen this. Most of you fucking fetuses in this chat will not have seen this because it's from 2004 when John Kerry was running against George Bush, an election that I was wildly emotionally invested in, hilariously, because the stakes now are supposed to be so much higher, and I care basically 0% as much as I did in 2004. So it was him visiting a nuclear facility, I think. It was some sort of clean room, some sort of technological clean room that he was crawling through a tube, a white tube, and he was wearing a white containment suit, and his nose is like this, and he looked like a bunny rabbit. It's the closest thing a presidential candidate has done to appearing as a furry. But yes, the bunny suit photo. There's just something about his face that fills me with revulsion at myself for having ever cared about him being president, at him for what a disgusting cretin and spineless little twerp he became in his life. Also, just a general embarrassment for the country that we have our fucking presidential candidates do this childish bullshit. That's how the level of our discourse, a bunch of just easily amused toddlers. It's a bummer, man. He wasn't just Secretary of State, John Kerry. He was decent. He actually did the Iran deal. He did the Cuban entry, the Cuban reopening, which of course is now dead. But he actually had, he was much better than Hillary Clinton. But obviously still very bad in any absolute sense.
Ooh, this is an interesting one. Who is the most cringe president? That's a good question. I gotta think back through here. Cringiest president. I would say, from the modern perspective, and maybe even at the time, it's got to be Nixon, due to his raw need, right? Because that's what cringe is. You're cringing with embarrassment. You're cringing because you're imagining how bad it would feel if you had said that, right? That's why you're cringing. And Nixon, his entire public presentation was this hangdog, very kind of self-consciously self-pitying style. And then, of course, he debates with Kennedy and just gets trounced because he looks like a sallow loser. And then he does things like, after he lost the 1962 gubernatorial race to Pat Brown, he just vents to the media and he goes, "You guys won't have Dick Nixon to kick her out anymore." I mean, and then he had to resign. The only guy ever to do it. Embarrassing. Oh, God, can you imagine just giving it up? "Every instinct in my body rebels against the notion, but I must step down." Of course, the guy had wanted to be president. All these guys, they've only ever wanted to be president. And he gave it up because of how badly he fucked up. And the whole time sweating, 5 o'clock shadow, talking about his mother. "My mother is a saint." That's embarrassing. George H.W. Bush, also very cringe. Because one-termer, and one-termers are all cringe. Carter's cringe. Poor Martin Van Buren, as much as he was a political genius, is kind of cringe. The guy built the democracy around the figure of Andrew Jackson, and then he gets turfed out after one term because of a depression that started under Jackson, and then spends the whole time getting derided as a little fancy lad with silk cufflinks and fine wines sitting in the White House, even though he was the guy who invented the democracy, the Democratic Party, originally founded around yeoman masculinity. And some fucking Whig, the party of church boys and financiers, the cityfied party, gets this guy to come in from a war. A guy come from the war with the natives, which is exactly the kind of thing the Democrats waged unceasingly to keep the mob at bay with land. And he fucking says, I grew up in a log cabin and drank hard cider. What did you do, you little fancy lad?" And it worked. Can you believe it? Embarrassing. Like the rush of mighty water, all the country through. It is the ball I'm rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with it we'll beat little Van. Van is a used up man. Damn it. Nobody remembers anything about Martin Van Buren. But maybe they heard that song. Van is a used up man. I mean, that's a fucking diss. That's shade. That's tea and I'm sipping it. The guy was a fucking political genius. The guy invented the modern political party. Basically from scratch. From the ruins of the era of good feeling. And under the nose of poor John Quincy Adams, who thought he was living in a post-sectional America. Can you believe it? Van Buren saw, no, this system, this conflicts, they're going to be resolved through political reams. They're going to be resolved along party lines. They're going to be resolved factionally. The dream of a non-factional democracy in a capitalist system where all relationships produce conflicts and contradictions that have to be resolved will not involve party conflict? Foolish. Yes, Trump is not cringe. Not yet anyway, although he's getting there. I gotta say, if he loses, he'll be cringe. The whole thing will be cringe retroactively. Obama, the thing is, it worked. I don't know if you can ever call a president cringe when he cruises through 2 terms. I mean, he got his ass kicked, but did he care? Like, all the stuff that he got his ass kicked on is not stuff that he cares about. What he cares about is got 2 terms, is cool, hangs out with Hollywood celebrities, gets to eat the baby brains with all the other guys. Hard to imagine he's cringe then. Truman can't be cringe because there's no more epic moment than the 1948 election. Holding up the Dewey Beach Truman Chicago Times. You will not beat that for ownage. That gets you through a lot. Lyndon Johnson also very cringe. That's a hell of a cringe spell there. And of course it comes after the coolest president, right? I would also say that McKinley and Garfield are cringe because they're the presidents who got assassinated but nobody remembers, which is brutal. That's like absolutely... They're not here to cringe, but we get to cringe at the thought of being that, even though we wouldn't know. Because, like, you think about assassinated presidents, it's Lincoln and fucking JFK. And they have all those things in common, right? Oh, Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy. Kennedy's secretary was named Lincoln. Kennedy got shot in a Lincoln. A Ford Lincoln. Lincoln got shot in a Ford's theater. And that completely ignores those two losers. I would say John Quincy Adams was cringe in his lifetime, but is now based completely. Andrew Johnson was cringe in that he would do things like go on drunken rants. I mean, he was shit-faced at his inauguration, which was, ad hoc in front of a judge because the president had just been shot. But he was hammered. He gave a speech. He gave an impromptu speech that was filled with vituperative bitterness and resentment because he was super self-conscious of the fact that he was a Tennessee hillbilly. But he also pissed off. He was able to single-handedly derail Reconstruction to the horror of basically the entire political class of the winning country. Like, we won that shit, and the party that won it was in charge of the entire legislature, and couldn't do anything, or couldn't do a lot of the stuff it wanted to do because this fucking cornpone shithead was hooting a jug in the White House. So that made him based. The fact that he was able to exert that kind of power in the face of unified opposition almost. Jimmy Carter was incredibly cringe. Hey everybody, there's this terminal crisis of capitalism happening. We cannot consume at the rate we used to. You guys just need to all wear sweaters and feel bad about yourself for being so materialistic. And everyone's going to see the importance of that. And they're going to pat me on the back for being straight with him. That was for like 5 minutes people did. He got a big bump after that speech. People forget that. But then at the end of the hostage crisis happened, and it was like, oh yeah, you're just a big wuss. You're just a big fucking wuss. Yeah, Carter was a complete psycho. Did you guys know this? He did not have a chief of staff for his first 2 years in office. He was essentially his own chief of staff. Chief of staff is one of the most intense jobs in Washington. Very few people do it for more than 2 years, unless they have like no family. Like Andy Card, I think, was Bush's Secretary of State, Chief of Staff. He was Bush's chief of staff for the full second term, but he was like an incel. He had no wife, he had no kids. It's usually 2 years. And he was president and chief of staff for the first 2 years of his term. Wow, nutcase. Carter sold everyone a good bill of goods. Carter was Obama. And the reason he's cringe and Obama isn't is because Obama got that second term, baby. Can't fucking, no phase. Can't see him. Got that second term. Carter got the boot because the forces allied against him in the wrong order. Booyah, out of here. He sucked. And he got people in because he convinced people that he was a good person. That he was a good human being. And that's what mattered. Because everyone had been horrified by Nixon, and because we cannot systematize anything, because we have to personalize everything, that's what this culture does, Nixon's evil had to be described in personal terms, his personal personality and his personal wickedness. And that meant that the problem of the lack of trust we now had in our political institutions, it's not because gas has gone up 100%, it's not because every factory in the country is already starting to shut down, that things cost more and people are making less. No. That has nothing to do with it. It's because we have evil people in charge. And if we get a good guy in there, he'll be good. And the thing is that was also what Carter thought. Carter thought he was a good person. He wasn't lying, and that's why people believed him. He was not selling people some fraud about how he was a great guy. He really thought he was a great guy, and tending his moral garden was the only thing he really cared about. And that meant that when he was confronted with the crisis of stagflation, his answer was, we need to be virtuous, and that starts with me. And one of the most virtuous things I could do is start imposing limits on what's politically possible in terms of spending, and tell people that, hey, you know how we're the Democratic Party and our job is to provide you with the goods of capitalism? You don't get any of that. They still get to keep all the gooker. The corporations are still in charge of everything. They still run your life and they demand your money, and they get all the profit, but you're going to get less money, and you should just fill that hole with spirit. I'm not going to give you even an idea where to get any of that. Read some for Christopher Lash or go to church. I don't fucking know. And it's virtuous of me to level with you. And you know what? If I lose power, if I get out of office, it's virtuous too. And Carter losing was obviously kind of like, maybe not at the time, but in retrospect, it's probably one of that sicko's favorite moments of his life is losing, because he feels like he now can, in his mind, believe that he did what all Christians are called to do, and that is imitate Christ in his life. He was martyred. He was crucified on a cross of fiscal responsibility. Most zooted president is very easy. JFK. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, like Hitler, was absolutely flying on amphetamines at all times. He had a guy, a Dr. Feelgood, who just boosted his ass up with amphetamine injections on the regular, partially because he was riddled with pain. He had the image of this vigorous young jock, the front of the new generation of Americans born in this century. But he was him playing touch football on the lawn with the boys. But he was actually wildly ill his whole life. He had Addison's disease, which can make your eyeballs bug out, and I think it's a thyroid condition. And he also had, courtesy I think of the PT-109 or something else, just an awfully bad back. And he was in a lot of pain basically all the time because of his back injuries. He was just in pain all the time, and so he was on medication all the time. And he would get boosted, and then he would go score with 2 secretaries in the pool under the White House, have affairs with the mistresses of multiple mob bosses. I always thought a funny counterfactual would be, like JFK's Dr. Feelgood comes in a little bit too feeling good himself and like overdoses Kennedy and his heart explodes like on day 3 of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's a funny counterfactual because LBJ was not taken seriously during the Cuban Missile Crisis or ever by the Kennedys, which was bad in some cases because he kind of knew what they needed to do to get civil rights passed, but they thought they knew better than him on that. But when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was like the one pushing the maximal conflict line. He was saying, we got to escalate this. And they kind of just ignored him. But it's interesting to imagine that if he gets in there, right in the middle of the crisis, if that doesn't change the outcome in a significant way. Oh, somebody asked me this on Twitter, and now they're repeating it. The most cringe VP, vice president. That's an interesting question because all vice presidents, the ones who didn't become president anyway, are inherently cringe because look at you. Look how close you came, you schmuck. You frickin' zadrool. Losers. You got so close, couldn't get it. So they're all cringe, like, ooh. And then especially the ones who ran and lost. So guys like Gore, mega cringe. Mega cringe. Al Gore is highly cringe. So I'd say anybody who ran and lost, any VP who ran and lost is cringe. Which is why one of the things that makes Nixon cringe, even though he was president, is that he was also somehow one of those losers, even though he eventually won. John Nance Garner's pretty cringe. The guy was 2 terms under VP under FDR, hated it every minute. He's the guy who famously said the vice president ain't worth a bucket of warm piss. And worst of all, it was because he represented the Southern reactionary segment of the Democratic Party, and he just watched in horror as those East Coast fancy lad New Dealers ran roughshod over the place. And he was going to go in there and clean house because he was assuming, like everybody, that you only do 2 terms. But Franklin, good old FDR, got in the end of that convention, and he didn't trust any of those other horses to carry the ferry across the river. So he did it, and after telling Garner he wouldn't, and he was pretty pissed. So he got owned. There was a guy named Richard Mentor Johnson who was Van Buren's VP, who was wildly scandalous, mainly because he, this isn't cringe in the present moment, of course, but it certainly would have been cringe at the time. He, like many slave owners of the day, he had a relationship of one kind or another with a slave and children by her. But unlike those guys who kept it on the down low, taking the candle to the back room or whatever, I don't think he married her, but he had her as a public consort, and it was Scandalous. I would say that Henry Wallace is pretty cringe. Definitely. One, because God, he got so close. If FDR died a little earlier, or the right wingers hadn't foisted Truman onto FDR at the convention, he could have been president. But the thing is, he was kind of a goofus. I mean, it's known now that the entire Progressive Party that he ran on, that they've kind of like spun up out of nowhere for him to run on the platform of, was just entirely shot through with communists. And, you know, of course you go, that's epic, that's cool, that's epically cool. But the thing is, the one guy on earth who didn't know that was Henry Wallace. He was a genuine, like, good government, progressive type from the Midwest. Like, he was a farm expert. Just he was a nerd. He didn't even know that he was sort of being moved around by Moscow. Which, again, hey, if he'd gotten into the presidency, and like set the course of the Cold War differently, you know, that's a real counterfactual that might have genuine valence in terms of changing the larger direction of history. Cheney is based as hell. Cheney's not cringe. Come on, the guy ran the entire show by himself. He fucking took his house off of Google satellite views. He had a man-sized safe at his office. He suggested himself for his job and then took over the other guy's job. Nothing cringe about Cheney. Evil, yes, but not cringe. William Rufus Devane King died 2 months. He never even got sworn in. He died in Cuba of yellow fever or malaria or something. The other thing about William Rufus Devane King is that he was noted in Washington for his flamboyant appearance, dress, and affect. And when you read the way people talk about him, it's pretty clear if you read between the lines that he was a fancy man, I guess you'd say it. He was fabulous, I guess you'd call it. His nickname in Washington was Miss Nancy. That'll give you an idea. Andrew Jackson called him Miss Nancy, and James Buchanan, who was a good friend of his, Aunt Fancy. So they were boyfriends. William Rufus Devane King and James Buchanan were probably boyfriend and boyfriend. So that's not cringe in 20th century standards, by 21st century standards, but it was probably pretty cringe at the time. And then he died before even really taking office. Also cringe. Hubert Humphrey is pretty cringe. Oh, yeah. Ooh, that's got to be high on the list. So Hubert Humphrey was a guy who super ambitious, sort of a northern LBJ, at least in like his clear craving for high office. He was the boy mayor of Minneapolis. He famously got the Dixiecrats to walk out of the DNC in 1948 for giving a speech about putting a civil rights plank into the party platform. Then he became a senator from Minnesota. He was a favorite of the AFL-CIO. And he ran for president in '60 against Kennedy, and he just got blown off the stage by the glamour. There's a great documentary called Primary, about the Wisconsin primary in 1960, which a lot of people thought was going to definitely be Humphreys, because he was considered like the third senator from Wisconsin, because he was always a guaranteed vote on all of the dairy price support legislation that Wisconsinites cared about very, very much back then. They still do, but not as much as they used to. We had a guy, Herb Cole, who was fucking senator for life, basically, because he was the guy in Washington who made sure that that the milk stayed above a certain price. So, and then Kennedy is this, jet-setting East Coast Catholic guy in a state that, even though you've got Catholics obviously in Milwaukee, has a large, rural Protestant population. And there's this footage of poor Hubert Humphrey and like a VFW hall in rural Wisconsin going, "I'll tell you about this Kennedy. He doesn't know an ear of corn from a ukulele." But then you see Kennedy in Milwaukee, surrounded by a bunch of Bavarians and Polacks, just like losing their shit. And he won. And then he won in West Virginia, which was huge. Of course, the Teamsters helped him out there. But so he was an ambitious guy, got to be LBJ's VP, got bullied by LBJ the whole 4 years, basically forced by LBJ to take his and run for president with his Vietnam policy. Like, that was the condition of Johnson's support to Humphrey for the nomination, which, of course, he had to wrest from the dead grip of RFK at the fucking convention in the face of a giant police riot and screaming and a tumult within. The condition for LBJ supporting him was, you better fucking take my position, even though he didn't really believe in it. And so he had to fucking flog that dead dog of LBJ's Vietnam policy until the fall, when he finally, last month ago, he stopped supporting it and called for a moratorium on bombing and a peace pursuit, like being prioritized. And he actually had been way in the back in the polls, and he kind of climbed. And then the election itself was very, very close. If you look at it, Nixon won the Electoral College pretty convincingly, but the actual vote total was almost a tie. I mean, it wasn't 1960, but it was very, very close. And it could have gone the other way very easily, especially if Humphrey had gotten out of LBJ's pocket a little earlier. So by virtue of just being a cringing toady who ended up going down, a guy who really was a very principled dude, his early career was like a civil rights stalwart and also a labor first guy who's like providing his presiding political obsession was to create full employment in America through like a guaranteed federal jobs program, which was something that the right fought tooth and nail until it was finally passed during the Carter administration, but by that point had its entire actual enforceability and meaning drained from it. So loser, big old loser. And Nixon, it's funny, Nixon actually, LBJ actually played footsie with Nixon during the campaign because he worried about Humphrey stabbing in the back on Vietnam, because at that point he was psychopathically obsessed with protecting his legacy on Vietnam and his position. So he was willing to that's how far he went to make sure that Humphrey stayed on the team. So he whipped his ass down the fucking campaign trail until he finally was able to get out from under it, but it was too late. Absolute cringe. Pence is incredibly cringe. I mean, come on. To just be such a colorless cipher known mostly for being an absolute repressed Christian freak while this guy's president, come on. Pathetic. Dan Quayle is very cringe. He ran for president too, just not after that. He ran in 2000 and got no votes. So Dan Quayle, he was an actual just punchline. He was only known nationally for being just a dumb goofus and for spelling potato wrong. So he's definitely very high on the list. The first guy I think of, really, is Quayle. Quayle and Pence, both from Indiana. Man, what a dire presidential state. So they've got two of the most cringe vice presidents ever, and their one president, William Henry Harrison, A, wasn't from Indiana, and B, fucking died his ass because he drank poo-poo water a month after being inaugurated. He shitted out his doo-doo ass. Can you believe it? There's only one answer to the question, most cringe presidential candidate. There are many contenders. George Romney, Mitt's dad, very high on that list. Mitt Romney, also high on that list. Adlai Stevenson, of course. Anybody who ran more than once, they get the stink of loser on them, like the Buffalo Bills or the Vikings. So Adlai Stevenson, Henry Clay, William Jennings Bryan, losers. Bob Dole, guy who ran his whole life. But I don't think any of them compare to number one with a bullet. Oh, Hillary's on the list, of course. Hillary's highly cringe. Hillary may be number two. Number one, with a bullet and an exclamation point, Jeb. John Ellis Bush. Just, please clap. You can't beat it. Can't beat it. And when you consider how much money he spent per delegate in that, which is, I think, by far the largest amount ever. He got like 2 delegates, I think, and he spent over $100 million. I believe that's like the quick math there. So it's something like $15 million a delegate. After coming from the pole position, and being like not being like some crank millionaire who spends his own money, being the inside track guy. And he was the loved son. He was the good guy. He was the one who followed the rules. Well, George was out gallivanting and snorting coke in the fucking cockpit of a fucking A-10 Wardog. This guy was studying the blade. He learned Spanish. He went to campaign. He went to Puerto Rico with his Mexican wife to like campaign for his dad when he was running against Reagan in 1980. Well, George did nothing. And who got to be president for 8 years? Who got to be president? Goofus, not Gallant. Gallant gets to show up 8 years later after his fucking family's name is shit because of how badly his dumbass brother fucked everything up, and all because he lost his first race. Lawton Childs is who we have to thank for that. Lawton Childs beat him for governor in his first run, which threw off the timetable. And he was in his first term in Florida. It took him that long to get back in, which was not enough time, whereas George had already had 2 terms in Texas because he went like 2 years later. If he'd gotten it then, if he'd gotten the Florida presidency then, or the Florida governorship then, he would have been the candidate in 2000. Now, maybe he doesn't win in 2000. There's an interesting counterfactual, because there is something to George Bush's just frat boy, dipshit charisma. Like, I always hated him and never thought he was charming, because he is just like a bully. He's like a rich bully asshole, but that's an archetype that a lot of people like. Jeb is sort of absolutely without character. He's drained. He doesn't even have sort of the towering noblesse oblige of his dad. Like, his dad was obviously a weenie. You know, they called him a wimp and everything. This blue blood. But he also just had this imperious authority that meant that it didn't matter that you thought he was a nerd. He was still judging you, and that made you kind of feel some sort of respect for him. Jeb had nothing. Jeb is just this cringing and obsequious toad boy. Yes, the cringiest of the cringe. The funniest, I'll leave on this, the funniest president other than Trump. All right, you got to go with when they are president. So they're funny presidents. Man, they really aren't very funny as a group. Nixon's pretty funny, obviously, just because of the face and the noise and the voice and all that. I guess Taft, because he was fat, got stuck in a bathtub. That's classic hijinks. And when you consider how much comedy back then revolved around like a fat guy getting into hijinks, it was essentially like Hardy from Laurel and Hardy was president. I have to say, though, people make fun of Taft for getting stuck in the bathtub. I'm pretty sure that if I tried to just go in the bathtub that he got stuck in, I'd get stuck in it. Because he looks like a big fat guy in the pictures, and he's remembered as the fattest president. But he was like 300 pounds. Which, in modern context of America, is not that big. And he was tall. So, those bathtubs were made for people who were much smaller. So, if I got in that exact bathtub, I'd probably get my ass stuck in it.
Who's the most cucked president? I mean, not in terms of, I wouldn't say in terms of politics or like sexuality, but just in terms of a guy who got owned sort of pathetically. William Howard Taft has got to be up there. So Taft never really wanted to be president. He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. And he is essentially badgered into running for president by Teddy Roosevelt and his wife, who really wanted to be first lady. And to please both of them, he ran for president. Almost immediately, his wife, who was very much looking forward to being first lady and living in the White House, had a fucking debilitating stroke. And the wind went out of his sails, and he just sort of went through the motions. And then, while he's being president, the guy who helped like drag him into it is yelling at him and saying he's not good enough, doing enough job, and then challenges him for president, and then runs against him and gets more votes and gets more electoral votes, and becomes the last time one of the two major parties finished out of 1 or 2 in the electoral vote count, and the popular vote count for that matter. That's cucked. But he uncucked himself by later, finally, getting the job that he dreamed of when they made him Supreme Court justice, which is a nice little... maybe he got owned so bad that they had to give him a consolation prize. And lucky for him, it's what he wanted all along. Least evil U.S. president is obviously Lincoln. There's no contest, because if you look at evil and good as like a good place style point system, Lincoln got all the bad points off that all American presidents of the 19th century got, mostly related to Native American dispossession and genocide. He did preside over the largest mass execution in American history of Sioux Indians in Minnesota after an uprising there in the middle of the Civil War. He also instituted the Homestead Act, which was just a giant settler free-for-all, just a come-to-get-it buffet on Native American land. So, but every other president in the 19th century has all those same points off. Lincoln has ending slavery. So that means even if he's still in the red, even if he doesn't go to heaven, he is still relatively way higher up in the rankings of just like pure numbers, like pure negative or positive numbers of, sin points as any American president could ever come close to. Second, I would say John Quincy Adams. But he's a distant second, obviously. Oh, and U.S. Grant. Those are the top three. Yeah, that's it. Those are the three least evil. And like I said, I don't even know if they have positive or negative point numbers, but they have way fewer negative points than any of the other ones. Grant was cool. John Quincy Adams, well, he was he was a one-termer, so he had less time to do bad stuff. He was a guy who he did want a non-confrontational Indian policy. I mean, compared to a guy like Jackson or even Van Buren, he was a fucking peacenik on the question. He presided over a slave state country, but he was against slavery, and he fought against it afterwards as a congressman. I mean, he famously defended the Amistad Africans before the Supreme Court, as depicted in the Steven Spielberg film Amistad. So, yeah, no, I would say. And he, he is the visionaries of non-interventionist American foreign policy. There's a reason that those that Koch-funded foreign policy think tank that just opened is called the John Quincy Adams Institute, because he's like the guiding light of those kind of guys, like the guy who warned against, even but it was still in its very early stages, what American imperialism and expansionism would mean in terms of moral. He was a clarion call. Like, he knew what was going to happen. He knew what expanding westward was going to do, how he was going to just destroy the spirit and like the morality of any kind of project that was being done in America. How it's going to just fundamentally rupture the social fabric and destroy the legitimacy of the state from a moral perspective. So I give him a lot of credit on that. And then Grant, presided over Indian massacres and stuff, but also did not want to do that. I mean, he did want to pursue a less violent Indian policy, but those around him were not interested in doing it, and he couldn't really ever assert control that way. But he also effectively pursued Reconstruction. Fucking broke up the Klan in its first iteration, and as soon as he left, the whole thing fell fucking apart. But like, he put his foot on the gas there, and I give him respect for that. So those are my top three.
I mean, the very fact that we talk about presidents, even on the left, like, he's a good president, he's a bad president. Actually, there are no good presidents. Or, here's my top 10 list of presidents. I do that all the time too. And the thing is, you can do that. It is within the discrete apertures of choice that presidents have. You can pick the ones who did a better and a worse job with the freedom they had. Absolutely. But we think of it the way you about ranking that with the same sort of drama that you think about ranking best baseball players of all time. But it's much more like ranking the best umpires of all time. You could do it. There are better and worse umpires, objectively, but it would be a very boring, dull, deterministic action because of how constrained their choices are. Whereas ranking the best baseball players, you're talking about the entire wild, causally open, near randomized possibility of all opportunities for every at-bat. Near infinite. There's a near infinite, the number of things that could happen when you fucking get into the
the number of ways that a at bat can end are so varied. It's mind blowing. It's mind boggling. But every choice by an umpire is strike or ball or fair foul. But that's the reality of the options, of the choices that presidents have. They're fully determined. I mean, we're all fully determined by circumstances, but they're more obviously through our ability to study the historical record that leads to decisions. We can see how constrained they are, much more than individuals without power. Like, we're all fully determined in what we're going to do, but the decisions are so personal that delving into the depths of the causality, like the deep stuff, things in the subconscious that happened years and years ago that nobody even knew at the time, including especially the person who's thinking them. That means that determining their choices their degree of fixedness is very difficult. For a president, the monumental size of the choices a president gets to make, you can almost fully map why. And you can like squeeze the amount of agency out of it, like the percentage out of 100 agency out of it. And I guarantee you it's like in the single digits.